So hi, it's 1 minute past, so we're gonna get going. So I'm Tony Goldstone, and I'm just gonna do essentially a Q&A today. So just going to spend 5 minutes going over something called triage because that's a really important bit of the process, and then around 55 minutes answering your questions. I've already gone over in YouTube's before about what this whole kind of remedial pension saving statement business is about. And essentially, it's trying to correct the age discrimination of the McLeod and Sargent cases. And for people that were impacted by pension tax, it means that they've got to relook at the 7 years during the remedy period, that's 2015 to 22, and then also because they delayed the 22-23 tax year that year as well. And to do that, HMRC have designed something called the HMRC Digital Service, and this panel in the middle relates to that digital service. And this, the digital service is a monster. It's about 230 pages long for people with private pensions, and for people without private pensions, the most simple cases, even so, it's over 180 pages long. But essentially, this is 10 or 20 pages in, and if you get to this page, it means that you fail triage, and then you're expected to use the full service. So I'm just going to spend 5 minutes just talking about what's before this, and this kind of triage on a page process that I've developed. So I'm just going to move over to the brown envelope cam, which hopefully you can see. And if you've not already printed this out, if you go to bit.ly/TG McLeod triage, or point your camera at that QR code, you can print out this simple one-page tool. So I'm just going to very quickly talk you through it and how it will help you with the triage process. So this is my RPSS. I kind of opened it on a live a couple of weeks ago, so I'm not going to go through all of it. But there's lots of pages. This is the England and Wales one. This is a really useful page. It shows all the numbers split into the old legacy schemes and the new 2015 scheme. There's also lots of kind of more technically detailed bits. There was a bit of a tip there if you go back to the first video, but if this value here for 1516 is over 826,000, you were doing pretty well, and it means you might still be able to get IP16, but I'm not going to cover that again today. More opening and closing values really of technical use only, but certainly for the England and Wales RPSS, this is where it's all at, which is the summary page, and this triage on a page is designed to help you look at this summary page. And basically, triage involves asking the 6 questions, and you don't have to answer all of them. If you fail on one bit, then you've got to do a full submission. So question 1 is kind of the key one really. Have you paid any AA between 1516 and 2122? And you can answer that partly via the RPSS, because these reds bit here are in scheme pays. So these are my actual values. So you can see I had lots of scheme pays loans. So for me, I'm an instant fail. I know I've got to do a full submission. But I also paid some via cash before it had used all my savings. So you really need to combine it with the information from tax returns. But you should know whether or not you paid AA charges in that 7-year period. So question 2 is a very niche question, and the actual question is have your contributions changed? And that's because in other schemes, not the NHS, there's different contribution rates between the legacy and reform schemes. This only applies to locum GPs, subject to something called annualisation. The vast majority of people it doesn't affect, and you would know about it if you're a locum GP subject to annualisation. And then there's these 2 supplementary questions, but they can be ignored if you're not a locum GP subject to annualisation. So question 3 is an important one. Have any of your contributions gone higher in any year during the remedy? So you basically need to compare this column, which are the old pension input amounts, and this column, which are the new amounts. So if we just do that for mine, you can see that all of mine go down. So for example here, 43 becomes 36, 51 becomes 44, 37 becomes 13, and so on and so forth. So I don't fail on that, but it doesn't matter because I've already failed on this question. But if any of yours go up in any of those years, then that's a fail. The next question, question 4, is your 22-23 growth greater than 40k? So that's this bit up here in yellow. So you can see I just fail that because mine's 40,286.37, and so if it's over 40k, that is a fail. So question 5 is trying to work out your risk of tapering, and so they're saying, is your net income above 190? And note that that's not the 200 figure that most of you are used to, and that's because when you actually get into the meat of the calculator, they ask lots and lots of questions about both threshold and adjusted income, and that's because the calculator in the background is working out what your threshold and adjusted income are against data that HMRC have already got about you, because I think they recognise that people and accountants and IFAs have got this wrong because it's pretty complicated. So that's why there's this kind of barrier, this kind of 10k buffer zone, if you like. So if your net income is above 190, that's a full submission. And question 6 is a very niche question. It's not talking about NHS pensions, it's talking about private pensions. And so if you flexibly accessed a pension after 2015, and then if you continue to contribute in it during the 22-23 tax year, then you're subject to something called the money purchase annual allowance. But again, ultra niche, and the vast majority of people that won't apply to. And why is this important? And it's important because if you fail triage, HMRC expect you to use the full service, the full 230 page service, and because it's extraordinarily complicated, and because you're only having to do it because you were discriminated against, hence you were eligible for McLeod, they will pay for up to £1,000, including VAT, for an accountant to do this for you. So if you fail triage on this bit, if you scan this QR or click on the links, and you can use this service by Forvis Mazars, and then they will do all of this for you and make sure that it's right, and you get all the compensation that you are due. So just coming back to the slides, so just 2 slides on what Forvis Mazars do. So this is the digital service sped up around 20 times. It's horrendously long and horrendously complicated, and there's a load of places where people can get tripped up by it. So I would strongly advise that if you are eligible to get the cost of this covered, i.e. if you fail triage, to use an accountant. So essentially, Forvis Mazars will get all your data. They will check over all your data for obvious errors, etc. They will feed that into this tool. Automated software will then use that to feed the HMRC tool. The first accountant will also know what the expected results are from the HMRC tool, and then the HMRC will spit out an answer, i.e. whether or not you due compensation, whether or not you've got additional tax to pay, etc. And then that's all checked over by a second accountant. So a 4-eye check by 2 qualified accountants. And just one slide on who Forvis Mazars are. Oh no, I've taken it out of the slide deck, so we'll miss that bit out. That's fine, and we will go on to questions, which I think is just this last slide here. So and just I'll leave these QRs on if I'm not needing to pull up any slides to answer questions. So this QR will give you some more information on who Forvis Mazars are and my association with them and what I've done with them. And if you just want to go ahead and register, there's just a short form to help pre-triage you, and then if you use that QR code there, that will take you to that, and you can register. So I'm going to dive in and take some questions, and my wife is kindly kind of helping copy stuff over from the chat. So I will just dive in and start with some questions. So ZC has said, I'm sure you'll go over it, but if the growth has gone up in 1819 out of scope, but slightly in 1920, can you still apply the normal AA calculator, or is it just better to apply for Mazars? So really good and important question. And so this whole process has been designed by HMRC, and there's obviously the stuff that's at the front facing bit of it, but there's also a load of stuff going on in the background of this calculator. And so HMRC have determined who they want to use the calculator and who they can safely say doesn't need to use the calculator. Now this bit about in scope and out of scope, if I just go back to to one of these slides here. If you just give me a second. So this is kind of McLeod on a page. And so if you just kind of concentrate on this bit at the bottom bit, we've got 5 years of carry forward data. We've got 7 years that need correcting. And then there's this 22-23 year, which has never been assessed before. And then, of course, we've also got the 23-24 tax year, which is the current year due for self-assessment by January. And this is split into out-of-scope bits and in-scope bits. So in-scope means if your tax charge goes up, you've still got to pay it. And obviously, if your tax charge went down, they will refund it. The out-of-scope bit means that if your tax charge goes down, they will give you compensation. But if it goes up, there's nothing they can do because it's out of scope. But coming back to ZC's question was, basically, if you've calculated that you don't have a charge to pay, do you still need to do a submission? And this is a question we put to HMRC. So we basically said, look, if an accountant is done the calculations using the annual allowance calculator and determined you've not got a charge to pay, do you still need to do a full submission? And the response from HMRC was that if charge is calculated that a submission needs to be made, there may be a reason for this that is not displayed. We would therefore suggest making a full submission. So you are expected still to go ahead and make a full submission, and that's your way of telling HMRC that you do or don't have a charge to pay. And if you need to make a full submission, then that £1,000 Inc VAT is going to be fully recompensable. So moving on to the next question that Joe has put up for me. If charge, how do we plan ahead and predict as best as possible future or current year's growth so we can act on it and take mitigating action? So that's a great question in the current environment, and it's a really difficult question to answer because I think, as we've all seen over the last 2 or 3 years, the way that both pensions and inflation and pay have changed, it's been much more changeable than it was in the period before that. So in terms of the rules have changed, inflation's been very labile, pay has been very labile because we've taken a stand and industrial action, and then pay is starting to go up relative to inflation. And for all of those reasons, it makes it really difficult to look at anything other than the current tax year. And in fact, I got a pension report 7 or 8 months ago from a leading provider, and I look at the figures from that now, and they're just completely out because no one was able to predict what the quantum of the pay awards are going to be. And so the things that make the biggest difference are things like inflation and pay awards and obviously pension tax policy. So I think looking forward beyond the current tax year is really difficult. That said, this current tax year, because we've taken a stand and because of pay restoration is in the process of beginning, some people are going to be in big trouble with pension tax year, including myself, in the 24-25 tax year. And I did tweet on Friday, I think, just a really quick way of trying to work out that if you're going to have a big problem in this 24-25 tax year. And so, put simply, if you take your October payslip, because that was the payslip where the back pay is been in for most consultants, for example, and because that's the 7th month, if you divide that by 7 and times it by 12, that should estimate your 24-25 pensionable pay. Now, caveat that with, if you have an increment this year, this method doesn't work, and there's also going to be a small adjustment for some but not all, depending on whether or not they paid the back pay into last March versus this year. But so if you've got that figure for 24-25, and then you take the figure, year-to-date figure from the March payslip, the March 24 payslip, that's last year, and divide one by the other, you can see the rough percentage increase in your pay. Now, because the formula for pension tax allows last year's inflation, it means that your pensionable pay was allowed to go up by 6.7%, but for some people in some years, so I incremented, so I'm year 14 just, I will be well above that 6.7%, and that spells very big pensionable growth in the 1995 section. So that's just kind of a rough and ready way of looking at it. In terms of what can you do, there are options if you know that you're going to get a big pension tax charge in year. So I think probably the most important mitigation is that if you're close to a tapering limit, so if you're close to taxable pay of 200k for this year, if you're going to have a big pension tax growth, really try to not be just above it, because if you're just above it, and then by the time you add in that big pension growth, you could be getting an eye-watering tapered annual allowance, and it could increase your charge by over 22,500. And I've done a couple of videos on that over the last few months, so I'll put that to the top of my Twitter feed so people can have a look at it. But there are other options. People can decrease the amount of work that they do. For example, they could look at taking a private pension, or a SIP payment to bring them under that threshold. And I know that sounds counterintuitive when you've got high growth to use a SIP, but if you're close enough to that 200k, that could help. And although I'm generally not an advocate of using salary sacrifice, car lease, etc., because you don't really know what's going to happen when you have to give it back. I think for some people, that's another option as well to decrease the pay this year. So question from Sally was really similar. Really worried about 24-25 has had a nice but unexpected increments. And thank everyone that took strike action for that. And for the pay rises that we got. I presume plus growth, a massive breach next year, but no way to calculate it. As I still don't have the 23-24 tax data, I have no idea if I have any carry forward to possibly mitigate. And this kind of lack of 23-24 data is just an absolute car crash. Because if we do the same exercise that I just described, so if you take the 23-24 and compare that to the 22-23, in that year it was allowed to go up by 10.1%. But Sally's actually said in her question that her pay it actually only got up 5% in 23-24 versus that 10.1% allowed. So two things happened in 23-24. So the first thing that happened is that the allowance went from 40 to 60, which meant obviously you're much less likely to taper. But the other important thing that happened is negative pension growth was allowed. So Sally, because her pay only went up 5%, but it was allowed to go up by 10.1%, is going to get a huge negative bit of growth in the 95 section, and that's going to offset her 2015 pension, which means she's going to have virtually no growth in that year, which means that she might easily be able to, for the first time possibly, generate carry forward of 50 or even the full 60,000 allowance into the 24-25 tax year. That said, if she's expecting a big pay rise this year, even with that, she might still have a problem. And that's me. So I know, even though I've asked for and not got my 23-24 paperwork, I know the numbers that are going to be on it. And for the first time ever, in 5 or 6 years, I'm going to actually have some carry forward and no charge, which is great. But despite that, I'm going to have a really significant charge because of my increment and because of the back pay following industrial action. So another question from Merle, and also Alison's asked a very similar question. So what figures should be used to calculate pension contributions and growth when on maternity leave? How would errors on this look on your RPSS statement, and what should you do if you suspect there are errors in your statement because of this? And Alison kind of is asked a related question about reallocation of pay arrears. Now, this is something I've been going on about to the scheme for a long time, and I met the head of pensions at NHS PSA up in Fylde in 2000 and was given a promise then that all of our pension savings statement data would be available in June of each tax year, not by October. And they also promised to put in pensionable pay. And so I'm just going to show you what they get in Northern Ireland. Will this let me zoom in? No, unfortunately not. So this is what they get in Northern Ireland. Bear in mind Northern Ireland is a small fraction of the size of the scheme in England and Wales. But you can see here they've got their 23-24 data, they've got their 22-23 data, They get pension, they get opening and closing lump sum, the PIA, but crucially, they get pensionable salary. And this is the really important figure to detect if you've had a problem. And it's really common to get problems after mat leave if the trust doesn't do your deemed pay correctly. It's also really common if you're changing the amount of less than full time or less than full time to full time that you've worked. And it's also a really common error if you've been in and out of the scheme or hokey cokey. And so I've been pleading with the scheme for years and years and years to do what is already done in Northern Ireland and Scotland, and that's put the pensionable salary that they've based the calculations on actually on the growth figures, because you can see, if your full-time equivalent pensionable salary should be 110, and if you've come back from mat leave and then they've based it on a work time equivalent salary of 150, you know that they've messed up. Now, as you know, they've still not done that, which leaves people in a problematic area that if they have got figures that look erroneous, then they probably need to start by speaking to their trust pensions officer and checking that all of the data has gone in correctly, or by contacting the NHS BSA. But it's a bit of a nightmare, and I'm afraid that the BSA have just done too little to be able to detect these errors. They're just very quick to blame the employer, but haven't really helped members be able to identify those problems, and haven't done enough in my personal opinion. So Dr. Sass, if we fail triage because of minor increases in the new PIA, that will be mopped up by a news carry forward. Do we need to do a full submission? So I think I've already answered that. That one above the HMRC view is that if it tells you need to do a full submission, you need to do a full submission, because that's their only way of capturing that you've received the RPSS, you've acted on it, and you've done the calculations correctly. Because, as I said before, this year there's better than ever data sharing between HMRC and the pension schemes, and there's better than ever error checking to check that people have done things like threshold and adjusted income correctly. And so I think that's why they want to drive people who are at risk of needing to pay tax to use the full tool to check whether or not they've done it correctly and whether or not there is a tax charge to pay. Already answered that one. So I won't mention the name. So overwhelmed by work, is there a deadline for sorting out RPSS with Forvis Mazars? Can I leave it for a few weeks? So of course, if you're too busy to do it, then it needs to go on the back burner. The only thing that I would say is that there are some bits of the process that take a bit of time. So, for example, if you engage Forvis Mazars or another accountant, they're going to, they need to do their due diligence and, money laundering checks, all the stuff that they're obliged to do by law. And then once they've engaged you, they've got to get some data from elsewhere, from the scheme, from HMRC, etc., to be able to do it all properly. And some of those will take 30 days or more to do. So we're already a pretty tight deadline. The deadline for most people is going to be 31st of Jan. So I would encourage people to register at their earliest opportunity to make sure that capacity continues to exist in the sector. And if people scan this QR, they can read more about the service. And then there's a separate QR to register, which should be on this one here, just to fill in this short form. And there's no obligation. After you've registered, you just simply kind of getting your place in the queue, and then you can decide whether or not you want to go ahead with it. But I would strongly encourage people not to ignore it, because I do think capacity in the sector is going to be pretty limited. So Peter, still haven't got the dreaded brown envelope. Should I be worried? And I think this question has appeared approximately a bazillion times in the chat, and I've definitely been asked this about a bazillion times as well. So this was the update I gave on this on the YouTube last week. So if we just kind of go down to the not received mine yet. So we know that there's about between 70 and 100,000 people who've had PSSs during the remedy period. So they're the people that are going to be due to be getting our PSSs. We know from public available information that they've sent out 57,000. We know from FOI data that there's going to be something like 22,000 GPs who unfortunately have got gaps in their record, which means that they need fixing first before an RPSS can be sent. And so that leaves about another 10,000 with records requiring manual calculations. Now, so I guess what people need to try and do is they need to try and work out, are you in that 57,000 group, in which case has it been lost in the post? Are you in that 10,000 group that need a manual calculation, or are you in that 25,000 group that have got problems where they need to get more data from your employer, etc.? My view, and it's only my personal view, is that we were told that all of this information was going to be in a portal by June each year. That then got put back to the 21-22 tax year. There was a statutory deadline of October, the 6th, for them to send you this information. In fact, the scheme had undertaken to start sending it out in April. And had they started sending it out in April, some of the problems that we started to see with this could have all been ironed out. And then, the financial services sector might have had, 9 or 10 months to deal with this, rather than, essentially you've got 3 months and 4 days left before the 31st of Jan deadline. So I think it's not unreasonable at all, if you've not received it in England and Wales, to contact the scheme, ask them to send it you electronically via email, and if they say that they can't send it to you, say, has it been calculated? Does it require manual calculation, or are you unable to calculate it to know when it is? If you've not received it, you don't have to do it till 3 months after you have received it. So, so if you get yours mid-Jan, then you've got 3 months from mid-Jan to do it. But that said, people probably want to be making decisions about this tax year. As I said, that difficult 24-25 tax year. And to do that, people need this information. And I don't know where Peter, don't know what nation Peter's from, but if he's in Scotland, they've said that they're going to be late. I have seen, I think, one from Scotland, this one here, and it was wrong, and both HMRC and SPPA have confirmed it's wrong. So, we know they're late, and if I was in Scotland, probably I wouldn't want to be at the front of the queue. I'd want to be close to the back of the queue and actually get the right figures rather than get figures that are obviously wrong. Uday asks, not possible to attend, will it be recorded and watched on YouTube? The answer is yes. Trevor P. So Trevor's asked about PSOs, and that's kind of ultra niche. So I'm not going to answer that bit of the question, but I'm going to answer the next bit, which is really important. So how does Hokey Cokey impact on figures, and how can you work out it's worth opting back in for the relevant 1995 months and years out, and how to do so? So I'm just going to go back to this slide that showed the years. So I think the first thing to say is I've kind of deliberately not talked about contingent decisions much at all in the 2 or 3 YouTubes that I've done already, and that's because the process isn't out yet. So we're still waiting for the process to be out. There's still serious problems with one of the data extracts that is going to need to come from ASR for this. So I'm a little bit reticent to give like an ultra detailed answer to this until we know what the process looks like, and what kind of help and support people can get to, and what compensation they can expect. But broadly speaking, anybody that opted out between October 2014 and April 2022, and anybody that stopped added years between those same dates, and I'll say them again, October 2014 and April 2022, is going to be able to buy back the service that they opted out from, and they can buy back some or all of it, and you're going to be required to pay the employee contribution, and your employer is going to pay via a centralised route the employer contribution. Now, if you remember what I said about in scope and out of scope, if your tax charge goes up in the in scope years, then you have to pay it. If it goes up in the out of scope years, you don't have to pay it. So if Trevor P, for example, had been in, let's say 15, 16, he'd been in, and then let's say he'd also been in 2021 and 21, 22, but it had these 4 years out, then if, for example, he came back in these 3 tax years and that created a tax liability, that tax liability is going to be written off because that's an out of scope year. Now also, if Trevor P works in England or Wales, if he creates a new or increased tax liability in 1920, in that year there was a compensation scheme, and we fought really hard to make sure that that compensation scheme stayed open till after McLeod was sorted out. So it could be, for example, that he could buy all of those 4 years if he'd been out for it, and then end up with no tax charge because either it's out of scope or it's going to come in this in scope year that's covered by the scheme. Now, just a couple of caveats. Obviously, it's not just about the tax charge in year. It's going to affect your carry forward, so it might affect changes further down the line. There's going to be other kind of ultra niche rules depending, how your pay is changed, whether or not it's advantageous to buy some or all of it, because some people might want to kind of lock in higher pay previously and then have a gap to get that pay protected by virtue of that gap. It's also going to get complicated if people have accessed recycled contributions, because the scheme rules have said that if people have accessed recycled contributions when they've opted out, then there'd be an expectation that they wouldn't be allowed to get the double benefit, because obviously they can't be just paid the employee contribution as pay, but then also expect the employer to then pay the employee contribution to buy it back. So it's going to get very complicated. It's going to require complex planning for people, and of course there is an expectation that the scheme is going to have to pay for that complex planning because they discriminated against you and that's why you came out. But all of that is subject to kind of confirmation in the rules, and so that's why I've been a little bit guarded about the kind of information that I've put out there about contingent decisions. But the principle is, if you opted out between October 14 and April 22 or stopped valid years in the same time period, you can buy that back, and you can do that over an extended period of time. So Will R asks, does the monthly increment impact the growth calculations and risk of AA charges, i.e. smoothing the increase across 2 years? And ridiculously, the answer to that is yes. And this is kind of one of the reasons why it's futile to kind of compare yourself to somebody else that may have been appointed at the same time as you and say, well, look, we had similar careers, and their charge is X and my charge is Y. It all depends on your exact circumstances, including the month that you're appointed. So if you were appointed as I was in September, that means you get roughly 6 months of the impact this year and 6 months of the impact next year. So because I've got that big year 14 rise in September this year, I'm going to have a huge tax charge this year, but I'm also going to have a huge tax charge next year, and it's going to be particularly punishing next year because we've just obviously heard that September CPI is 1.7%, so my salary is only allowed to go up 1.7% next year before being assessed against pension stats growth. So the remainder of the growth from that increment next year is going to be punishing, so I'm going to have 2 punishing tax charges. So Karen asks, is the best of last 3 years salary used to calculate pension financial years, i.e. April? I'm planning to retire March 26. Should I have stopped a salary sacrifice already? So it's nothing to do with financial years, and it's everything to do with the 3 years of your contribution history. So if you're contributing full-time to the scheme, it will be based on the last year, the year before, and the year before that, and they'll take the best of 3. So for example, let's say you've just had a big pay rise because of either an increment or because of the industrial action. It would take a year for that to kind of burn into your salary and becomes part of your contribution history. And so it's the same with salary sacrifice. So if you want the salary that's been sacrificed taken in consideration to your final salary, you need to stop that and then carry on working for 12 months whilst contributing towards the scheme for that to be in it. So Jane asks, I retired on 1st of October 2023, therefore most of my pension is from 95 scheme, paid AA tax, still waiting for my brown envelope, assuming that I have some AA to reclaim. Does the pension get recalculated and any other timescale? So interesting, Jane went on exactly the 1st of October, and I'm just going to quickly just bring this over here and just show you this graphic very quickly, because October 2023 is the cutoff. So if, as per the question, Jane was literally by 1st of October 2023, because you've taken your benefits by that date, your deadline is going to be pushed back to Jan 2027. So you're going to be kind of towards the back of the queue before you get anything. So don't worry about it, and your brown envelope will arrive in due time, and then you'll be able to sort all of that out. So I'm just going to have a Diet Coke break. So Planet Superlight asks, hope you may be able to update where Scotland is in terms of sending out brown envelopes. Thanks again. So I think I did just flash up quickly an SPPA one, the first one that I'd seen a couple of weeks ago. It's here, and it was wrong. And so SPPA have said, I'm certain that the negative PIA was an error, and HMRC have said, you're right, of course there is, and never was a concept of negative PIAs before 23-24. So we're waiting to see if they've got to the bottom of that error. It's also, and I hope SPPA colleagues don't mind me saying so, a little bit deficient in information compared to the RPSS that showed you from England and Wales. So the England and Wales one showed both split and combined pension growth, because the calculator requires you to put in combined pension growth. It also shows pre and post rollback growth, so you can do that bit about working out whether or not your pension amounts have gone up. And crucially, it also includes scheme pays on the RPSS in England and Wales. And so without all of those things, you might look at needing to be finding another 14 to 21 documents just to be able to use the HMRC service, rather than being able to do most of it from the RPSS. So we hope they've listened to that feedback. I think they've said that the deadlines are going to be closer to March, and so if you go back to that question earlier about when do people have to respond by, you'll have 3 months from when that's issued, which will obviously put people in a slightly difficult position in terms of being able to work out when so for example, can they take on overtime, do they need to invest in a SIP, etc., because you're going to need your RPSS data and your 23-24 tax year, and this does include the 23-24 tax year incidentally, on this RPSS, which is good, but we just need all of those to go out to people so that they can make those decisions. Tolu, what is likely to be the impact of the pay rises 24-25? More people would breach AA this year and with no carry forward. So I kind of covered that earlier about the little sum that you can do, and I did say on Friday I was going to try and do a little calculator, and unfortunately I've just been super busy all weekend and not had time to do that. But I will try and do something for the 24-25 tax year. But just on your specific question, so you can do that little trick with your pay slip from October to try and work out whether or not it's gone up more than 6.7%. But don't assume you're going to have no carry forward, because I don't know whether you're a consultant or a GP, but if you're a hospital doctor and your pay was trashed in 23-24, like all hospital doctors' pay was, unless you had a big increment, you should expect some carry forward from that 23-24 tax year. But the size of those pay awards, particularly for people that are in some of the years that had those bigger rises, is going to cause some really large pension growth and some really large pension tax charges, and myself included. Unfortunately, I'm going to have I think the biggest charge I've had, or one of the biggest charges I've had. But that said, it's important that we carry on trying to get our pay restored. We can't continually, constrain our wish to have our pay restored. These aren't, above inflation pay rises that, the media would like everyone to think that they are. This is a restoration of our pay, and so we need to get our pay restored, but there is going to be a bit of pension tax pain along the way. So Dr. David M says, in order to do 23-24 self-assessment submission, do I need your RPSS to do the carry forward? And the answer to that is yes. And I've made it pretty clear to government and to HMRC and to HMT that it's a bit ridiculous that we're expecting people to try and do this manually. Last year people couldn't do this because they didn't have the RPSS data for those 7 years, so they suspended the 22-23 reporting year for AA. The only thing that's changed for 23-24 is there's another year where you don't have the data. So expecting people to estimate that, I think, is a bit of an unreasonable ask. And so what the schemes need to do is get that information out urgently. And of course, BMA, myself, ASMA, SPPA and others have all written to HMRC and saying, look, you need to relax this deadline and or relax fines or interest, because virtually nobody is going to be able to estimate their position. So Jelly Terry asks, real numpty here, all my answers to the triage page are no except for where I have greater than 40k growth. Do I need to do anything? And the answer is yes, you need to do a full submission. And so that kind of comes back to that original question. In fact, Fulvis Mizars have asked HMRC this exact situation. So it's somebody that has never paid an AA charge before. They've calculated the growth and it's covered by carry forward. There's no charge to pay. Do they need to do a full submission? And the answer was yes. The answer from HMRC was yes, you do need to do a full submission. The other thing to consider with that as well is that by doing a full submission, it means your costs are compensable. So, for example, if you went ahead and paid an accountant to sort that out, then but didn't use the full tool, then you probably won't be able to claim back the costs of using that. I would follow HMRC's advice, and if you're advised to do a full submission, I would go ahead and do a full submission. So Which Medical says, why do BSA think I had a pension input of 118, 21, 22 when my pay increased by 1k? I had no awards. They then sent a second statement of 80k and can't tell me which is correct. Ineptitude ? Well, the answer is yes. Yes, there sounds like there's been an error there. I think you've implied that this is based on pension savings statements, not on the RPSS. So see what is on your RPSS, but it sounds like there's been an error, and that's been corrected. And as I said, there's common causes of errors. MAP pay changing less than full time to full time, people that have been in and out the scheme, or hokey cokey. Best of three used to be another common cause of errors till we highlighted it to the scheme, and then they fixed the automated calculation of those. But yeah, if it looks wrong, ask the scheme, say to the scheme it looks wrong, speak to your pensions officer, check the data, and check it looks correct. So Gareth, in simple terms, can I use over unused AA from 2010 to 2011? It's not an issue using 3 year, or do I wait for the 23-24 Brian envelope and calculate it based on the pay slips? So carry forward is really important. So I'm just going to go back to one of the slides from last week. So before this tool came out, I'd been given a bit of a sneak preview as to what it might look like from government, and said the years that you're asking are wrong, and if you bring it out like that, it's going to give the wrong answer. And they did bring it out, and it was wrong. And so because they hadn't gone back to the 10-11 tax year, you could give it scenarios where the compensation was wildly different. So it came out on the 6th of October 2023. We told them to add those 2 years. They added those 2 years, to be fair to them, very quickly. But you can see, for example, here the compensation for this 1 year has gone from 4,000 to 9,000. When it comes to carry forward, don't try and do it yourself and don't try and do it manually. Always use the HMRC tool, and obviously for the RPSS, the tool is this full HMRC digital service. So I've been going on about this for many years now. This was somebody back in 2019 saying, "Oh, thank you, I added in the extra years," and the charge was 2,500 less than their financial advisor reckoned that they owed. So don't try and do it manually. Just give all the data to the tool and let the tool do it using the HMRC service. So CB, I didn't have an AA charge in 21-22, no SA tax return that year. Now the input amount for 21-22 is increased. Can I still use scheme pays given the deadline extension? So yeah, absolutely. So scheme pays will be available for any new or increased charges for any of the in-scope years. So if you use this service and if there's any increased or new tax charges for 19-20, 21-22 or 22-23, then Forvis Mazars will identify that and ask you how you want to pay them, and that includes scheme pays even though the original deadlines have expired. If there's new charges in the 19-20 tax year, and if you're a clinician in England and Wales, that can be done against the annual allowance compensation scheme. So sorry, another drink because I'm losing my voice. I know the principles of calculating an annual PAA. Are there any calculator tools you would recommend for individuals or better pay for professional service? So, I was very much in favour of the kind of self-service model and trying to build tools that allowed people to do all of this themselves, but it's just too complicated. Particularly given that it's also involving so many years. You're also not allowed to use any calculated PIE figures. You're only allowed to use scheme provided figures. So I think the days of trying to kind of do all of these things manually and yourselves are probably behind us, just because of the complexity involved and the inability to get it wrong. So I generally would now advocate for getting a professional to do this. This particular exercise is a tax exercise. It's correcting tax, and the experts and the professionals in doing that are accountants, and they're obviously professionally accountable to be doing that and to do that correctly. So for this particular exercise for RPSSs, I would use accountants, and generally specialist medical accountants are the people that have been involved in AA for many years now. They're the experts, so I would advocate going to them. If we go back to Trevor P's question about the kind of what if in the future, and he was saying about buying back service that had been out of and running all the different scenarios, that's more of a planning question than an accountancy question. And so that's kind of more an independent financial advice, so people will be saying, look, the cost of you buying back those 4 years is going to be £60,000. You can pay it back over 7 years. What you're going to get back is, X amount of pension, based on standard longevity, that's going to be worth Y, etc. And therefore we recommend you do X, Y, or Z. So that's broadly, how I would kind of look at the split of professional advice. For tax and correcting tax, I personally would only use an accountant, and for the kind of wider advice piece, I would use a professionally qualified IFA, who again is kind of accountable for giving you the correct advice for your particular situation. So 3, say your threshold pay was just over 200k. Are you able to retrospectively make a charitable donation after April to bring threshold down below 200 for the previous tax year? So this is a great question, and this comes down to why HMRC want you to use the tool. So lots of people mistakenly think that gift aid reduces your threshold income, but it doesn't. And this is one of the reasons why HMRC are asking for how much gift aid you've done, and they are in the background trying to work out whether or not you've mistakenly used a gift aid to decrease your threshold income. So gift aid, in terms of cash to charity, does not affect your threshold or adjusted income. It does affect of income tax, obviously, and it would affect the marginal rate of tax that you would pay on an AA charge. But if you had threshold income of 210, you couldn't make a donation of 12k to bring you down and not taper. And this is precisely why HMRC have created this monster of a tool to try and work out that everything is being worked out correctly. Now, you could make a payment into a SIP, because by making a private pension contribution in year, that would decrease your threshold income, but obviously then it would also increase your pension growth because you've donated into a private pension. But the calculus of that is complicated. I did a video on it giving an example of a high earner for this tax year and showed how it could be really advantageous for that particular person to pay into a SIP. But don't think that paying into gift aid will bring you under the limit, because it doesn't affect it, I'm afraid. Footballers' dreams. Don't know whether footballers' dreams was watching the football, and I'm just going to quickly try and see if I can find out the result of the football. Oh, fantastic. It's a draw between Arsenal and Liverpool, which is exactly the result that I wanted as a Man City supporter. Has anyone had their 23-24 envelope yet? Do I need to ask for it? I'm expecting a huge bill for 23-24, so would have expected it automatically. So very few people have had their 23-24 envelopes. I can tell you personally, I've asked for it 3 times, and I've not even had an acknowledgement for that element of that request, which I think is disgraceful. So I would ask for it. Unfortunately, people in England and Wales are being fobbed off with a standard response at the moment, saying they're not answering questions for on-demand statements. I'm not sure of the legality of that. There are legal timelines that schemes have to provide an on-demand statement within 3 months, and if not, they can face fines for not doing so. So if you've not got it and you need it to be able to calculate your position, I would ask for it. The second bit, I don't know whether Footballers' Dreams is a GP or a hospital doctor. GPs obviously were always in care, so they may still have significant growth, and they might have a bill for 23-24. But if you're a hospital doctor, because of the higher allowance of 60,000 and negative PIAs, as I said before, you might actually be expecting a smaller pension growth than you're expecting, and therefore actually you might find yourself that you generate significant carry forward. But do ask for it if you've not got it. We're about 6 minutes left, so I'll answer another 4 or 5 questions maybe. How does paying into a SIP reduce your threshold pay? Sorry if this is obvious. Threshold income, you take off amounts that you pay into a pension. So it will, if, for example, your threshold income is, 210 before making a private pension payment, if you make a payment into a SIP, you can take the grossed up amount, and then that will come off, and then you can get yourself just the right side of that £200,000. So it's obviously important you try and accurately estimate what your year-end taxable pay is going to be, and then get advice about making the right SIP payment. It can be a really good way, if you're close to that £200,000 limit, to reduce it and then avoid tapering. That's not to say you'll completely get rid of a charge, because obviously if your growth is still above the general annual allowance of 60,000 even after carry forward, then you're still going to have a charge, but it will just mean that your charge doesn't go up because of tapering. And as I said, I did a video and some work numbers of a consultant colleague who has got a senior management role, doesn't do any private practice, is just the wrong side of 200k, and he can reduce his annual allowance liability by £22,500 by paying into a SIP. So it's definitely worth looking into if you estimate that you're going to be close to that £200,000 limit. Jonathan W. Can we get a rough idea how much each 10k of scheme pays use affects our final pension? It's pretty complicated, but it is doable, and I'm not going to try and answer it now, because if I do numbers out the back of off the top of my head, I'm going to get it wrong. So the video that I just mentioned, where I took an example through somebody who used a SIP, I do show what the scheme pays impact is, but the scheme pays impact obviously relies on a number of moving targets. So scheme pays is an interest bearing loan, and so it's based on CPI plus something called the scape rate, which is currently 1.7%. So obviously, as inflation has been pretty labile, the interest on that loan is going to be pretty labile, and so it also crucially depends on the age that you want to retire, because there's age dependent factors. But I promise that I will bring a worked example to the next one of these that I do, and I am doing something. I'm doing something on Thursday after the budget, actually. So I will try and bring a worked example on that for Jonathan's attention. So Tolu says, so a 25k pensionable increase in 24-25 is going to cause serious problems, ? And the answer to that is yes. So in terms of AA, that is going to cause a problem. So I have no idea what your salary was beforehand, but let's say for argument's sake it was 110. If it's gone from 110 to 135, that's a lot more than that 6.7% allowable increase. So that is going to cause very significant growth in the 1995 section. The 2008 section is a little bit more difficult because it averages those growths over 3 years, and it also takes previous pay into consideration over a 10-year period. So it makes it a lot more difficult to kind of calculate and work out what the income, what the expected worth is going to be. But yeah, I can promise you that if you've had a 25k pensionable pay increase, you're going to have a big pensionable growth. And if you've not got enough carry forward to mop that up, that's probably going to cause a charge. And I would look very, very carefully if you're at risk of tapering, because if you're at risk of tapering, then, and you can do something about it like a SIP, then that absolutely might be the right thing for you to do. And again, taking a SIP and getting more pension growth when you've already got huge pension growth, it seems the wrong thing to do. But if you can do it to avoid tapering, it's definitely potentially something that's going to be worthwhile. So Sahana asks, can the accountants get all of the figures they need from HMRC, tax figures from government, gateways, P60s, etc., etc.? Yes, absolutely. So this is something that I have been fighting for in the background for a wee while, because if it was the so if we kind of roll back to 18 months ago, I was going through an early version of this form with the developers of the HMRC service, and bear in mind I have some expertise in this and know my way around it, and I was using an earlier version of the tool that only had 80 pages rather than the current 200 odd pages, and I was doing it live with 10 or 15 bods from Accenture watching, and I was going into the portal from my accountants because I've had the same accountants for the whole time. I was trying to get all the information in real time to do this in real time, and it was just an impossibility. So I said at that point, I said less than 0.1% of people are going to be able to do this, and so HMRC are going to need to help them and provide them with some of the data. So we've worked in the background to get data extracts from HMRC, data extracts from the scheme. We're trying to get data extracts from ESR for contingent decisions, and that will make it all much, much easier for your accountant to get all of the correct data, and crucially to get all of the data that HMRC are going to be checking all your answers in the background against. So it makes complete sense to do it with an accountant who's going to get all the figures that they need from the Inland Revenue, and they're the figures that the HMRC calculator compares to yours in the background anyway. So that all makes complete sense. Mushtaq asks, currently in the process of doing my tax return, should I wait for Forvis Mazars to do the calculation before submitting the tax return, or just complete it, deal with any tax charge thereafter? So the current self-assessment for the 23-24 tax year is completely independent to the RPSS process, which doesn't use self-assessment. It uses the HMRC digital service. The only thing that you might need is carry forward. So you can only do the 23-24 bit for annual allowance if you know the answer to both RPSS, because that will tell you whether you've got any carry forward to take into the 23-24 tax year, and if you've got the 23-24 pension saving statement. So if that's you, then you can do it. If you're not able to do it because those processes haven't been completed, you can estimate it and put a note to that effect in your tax return, or your accountant can do that, and say, you're still awaiting for the outcome of X, Y, and Z before you can accurately say what your AA tax liability is. But as I said, for hospital doctors for 23-24, most people are not going to have a charge, even if they're tapered, because of the large negative growth in that year. Unless you had an increment or some other reason to have big growth in that year. So we're just past 7. So I'm just going to ask. I'm just going to answer 2 more questions. So John says, as a newish consultant 3 years in, never received an AA charge, will I need to work out charge? I haven't received my AA statement this year despite asking, or an RPSS yet. So, assuming that you were in the scheme at 2012 on the relevant date, so you are affected by the remedy, as well as in the scheme at some point between 2015 and 2022, you may or may not be getting an RPSS. So RPSSs will go to anyone that's ever had an RPSS. It's never had a pension saving statement. So if you have never had a pension saving statement, then you might not be getting an RPSS because you've never exceeded the annual allowance. But the easiest thing to do is just ping a line to the scheme and say, am I expected to get an RPSS or not? And they should be able to advise you. So I'm going to make this the last question. And Haley asked, really silly question, and there's no such thing as a really silly question. That's the whole point of me doing these Q&As, because people need to ask silly questions to be able to get the answers. So it's not a silly question at all. How do we request a 23-24 statement? Is there a web link, or do we email? So if you are in Northern Ireland, it should already be on your portal. If you are in Scotland, it should also be coming or be in your portal already. If you're in England and Wales, the NHS BSA promised us a portal by June 2020, and you might have noticed that it's not in the portal yet, and it wasn't in the portal when they promised it would be there for 21-22 either. So I'm afraid we are left with just having to ask for an on-demand statement. So I'll try and put it in the show notes afterwards, but there is an email address that you can email the NHS BSA, and you'll need to put certain things in it, like your name, address, your SD number, etc., to be able to communicate with them via email. Another good way, if you're on Twitter, etc., is send them a direct message, and they will then kind of ask you the bits that you need to be able to request it. So we're kind of 7:05 now, so we've gone a few minutes over. So the last 2 things is just very briefly to mention the budget. So I will be doing a post-budget analysis, and just to kind of a review of a bit more of all things brown envelope with colleagues from Forvis Mazars on Thursday at 8 p.m, entitled Trick or Treat. I guess the one thing I've not really mentioned, but I did mention in the previous ones, is that although this RPSS stuff all sounds very scary, if you've paid tax charges, it very likely means you're due for a significant refund. My refund is in the order of about £32,000. So although this whole process sounds horrible, if you've paid significant tax charges, you may well be in for a bit of a treat with your RPSS, but that of course involves you being able to do all the sums and do it, calculate it correctly. In terms of, is the budget going to be a trick or treat? We don't know. There's certainly been huge amounts of media speculation of all the things that are going to be in the budget. I tend not to get too involved in speculation. I'd rather see announced policy. So myself and colleagues from Fulvis Mazars will be giving you some overview of anything that's announced around pensions or pension taxation, if there's anything at all. But I suspect there probably will be, but I don't have a crystal ball either, so I don't know what the answer to that is. And finally, I hope you found today's session useful. I'm going to be doing more of these kind of Q&A sessions with colleagues from Fulvis Mazars or myself. But if you want more information about the service with Fulvis Mazars, you can scan that QR code there. Remember, if you fail triage, i.e. if you've had a pension tax charge in 1522, if your annual allowance is over 40k in 22-23, if your growth goes up in any year, you can get the full cost, £1,000 in VAT, refunded via the cost claim back scheme in England and Wales. We're still awaiting for information about the schemes in Scotland and Northern Ireland. If you're ready to sign up, you can use this QR here. As I said, we've asked governments for extensions to deadline because we're worried there's not going to be capacity in the sector. But I would strongly advise people register as soon as possible to secure their link, their position in the queue, particularly if they've already got their RPSS. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of the questions for everyone because we got too many. But hopefully we've picked a nice selection and it's answered most people's questions. But if not, please do join me for another one in the future.